Great, thank you very much. And when I heard I was getting to follow one of the students, I thought that'll make my life just so much easier, because inevitably they will set out a picture that I'm likely to agree with quite a lot, and that's happened as I expected. And so lots of what I'm going to say is really a footnote to McKenna's observations. But I should say, and perhaps that gives you a clue, that this speech does come with a bit of a health warning, because when it comes to education, I can be a little bit of a troublemaker. And that comes from my personal experience as a dyslexic, where I succeeded in all but the final stage of my education, which was at a university with a rather different approach, in spite of, not because of, the system. And so, just as in the classroom I was occasionally a little disruptive, it has made me instinctively disruptive about education ever since. And I have practiced that disruption as a teacher when I've been teaching universities over the years. I once caused a lot of trouble when I refused to, for a subject I had to teach. I said, I don't want a curricula, because actually that'll get in the way of learning here. Took a lot of arm wrestling to get the course approved. I said, I just want to start with a single question and see where we go. People had a little bit of kind of bravery in letting me do that, but I just wanted to start with a single question, which was, what's the right thing to do? And the only deal was at the end of each class, we'd figure out what the next question was that we needed to answer. And a day later, I'd send everybody some material to help them on that journey. And it was an extraordinary, wonderful adventure. I learned as much as the students did. And as it turned out, we covered much more than would ever have been packaged into a narrowly confined curriculum. I run a class where I gave everyone 100% for the assignment before they handed it in. In fact, before they started the course. And that was because I wanted them to get out of their comfort zone. I said it was an art assignment for a class that I was teaching in a Master of Entrepreneurship degree. And I wanted to do that because the previous year they didn't do too well. Once I actually released the pressure of them being assessed and gave them all 100%, they did extraordinary things. And the portfolio of work they produced was remarkable. I also taught an extremely high demand course in a very good university that got no credit and wasn't recognised on the transcript. And I think because of it. Now, why am I a troublemaker? And that's because I think the system of education, school and university, is designed to solve a policy problem about how we educate large numbers of people in an affordable way, rather than actually to enable people to grow. And the way we answered that question, which was a kind of 19th century answer, was basically to take the kind of industrial paradigm that existed then. And it's quite simple, really, that paradigm. Create an assembly line, whole set of boxes, move bunches of people through in job lots, 20 to 30 is not bad. Do that about every 60 minutes according to perhaps some tough standards that you set for this product you're creating. Make sure it's done standardisedly, ideally all around the country, despite how much variation there might be. Measure it carefully to make sure the standards are being met, the product is as you desired it to be, and progress them all at the same rate, despite the fact, of course, there's infinite variety. Now, in universities, we do essentially the same thing with one difference. We don't train the people on the assembly line. Yeah, that's right. At least in schools, we train people to teach and respect the fact that it's an extraordinarily skillful and difficult thing to do. Now, I think, of course, that's an industrial model, and it is largely what education systems run on, and it is, I think, to the great detriment of human growth and development. Now, I think post-industrial education is both necessary and, of course, actually happening. And I think there are lots of ways in which staff and students already subvert the current system in the interests of seeing people grow and thrive. And I think we can start to convert the kind of factories we've all inherited into something more post-industrial. In fact, as a former parent of this school, I know that's already happening here, and I celebrate it. So, in the short time I have, what might we do to start with this? McKenna said an awful lot of it, and I just have 4 thoughts. They're not revolutions, really, and they're not anything that hasn't been said before, but hopefully they're, on a day like this, useful conversation starters. I want to talk about inquirers, not learners, about T-shaped inquiry, about place-based inquiry, and about putting the profound back on the curriculum. Now, this notion of inquirers, not learners, I'm always nervous about the phrase learning. It implies transmission and an agenda set by somebody else. And those two things seem to me often where things start to go wrong. Inquiry starts with the self. It starts with curiosity. It's intrinsically growth-oriented. And it unlocks other qualities, and McKenna spoke to some of them, that passion. Inquirers become passionate about what is making them curious, what they're interested in, what has relevance, immediacy, importance to them. It's the right place to begin. And I got excited about that long ago when I saw what was happening in Reggio Emilia in northern Italy in primary schools, built around the kind of inquiry into what was fascinating kids, and just letting the learning follow the curiosity of people. And yet that isn't how we necessarily set about it. And all too often we still have, and the national curricula embodies it, a kind of it's good for them mindset, which is sort of the cod liver oil version of education. Here are a bunch of things, if people take it, will be good for them. I don't think that's the essence of growth, and few would think so, but it's all too easy for it to be so. Inquiry also, I think, breaks down the walls of classrooms, because it doesn't happen in 60-minute blocks, and it doesn't happen in any particular place. It occurs wherever that curiosity is present. And we end up discovering that learning is often not in the places we expected it. I used to run university college, in part because I believe deeply in learning in communities in intensive kinds of ways. Now, in every year we would survey students about where their learning happened, because that's an important kind of question. Not what did they learn, but where did they learn? Where did they learn most? And the answer was never lectures, never tutes, never the internet. Sometimes self-directed TED Talks outrated most other things. Again, they tended to be very inquiry-driven. But the number one place for learning was actually the dining room. It was sitting around food with peers talking about things that they were deeply interested in and inquiring about. Not to a set agenda. Normally the agenda was set by whatever was going on in the world, or actually by whatever people were fascinated about and wanted to share with their friends. And it was just consistent. Year in, year out, that's where they learned most. And so, of course, we aim to facilitate that. And inquiry obviously also invites a different approach to the way you might also assess. Because with inquiry, you can't really do standardised tests. You have to do different kinds of ways of assessing what's been learned. Portfolio approaches, and perhaps Stephen, who's one of my favourite disruptors, will say a word or two about it. It enables you actually to discover both in content and form what a student's really been inquiring into and discovering. And while I'm on an assessment, a side note on ATARs, because sometimes people ask what the Vice-Chancellors think of ATARs. Well, I don't think much of ATARs, because the evidence is that they're not actually very useful. So we've done work on ATARs. They predict, this is the best that they do, a third of students' performance for students who get an ATAR over 80. Only a third. 2/3 of it are explained by other things at the end of their first year. So all this effort into a score that predicts actually a very small part of what attainment looks like, and below 80, their predictive value drops pretty close to 0. Under 8, they just don't tell you what a learner is like under 80. Some of them will achieve extraordinary results, some of them won't. The only thing an ATAR does predict reliably at all levels of an ATAR is persistence, whether a student will actually finish what they're doing. Now, whether it is just whether there's any causation there or it's merely a correlation, we don't know, because we know all the other things that drive persistence. So we know something about it, but not enough. So an ATAR really, can you stick at that kind of learning, given that the learning in school is not radically dissimilar to the learning at university? It predicts stickability. It doesn't predict performance. And that, I think, says, can you stick at a similar form of education to the kind of education you got in school? And at some level, I think that may be a judgment on both of us, because we should be crediting learning where many, many more learners stick. So don't place massive value in it, and I'm delighted this year that the disruption of COVID, bad in many other ways, but in a few, has meant the system has embraced the university having a schools recommendation scheme where we can trust teachers rather than examiners to judge the quality of a student. Oddly enough, they've known them for quite a while and have a pretty good insight into them. They can assess things that we actually know matter, which isn't just academic things, it turns out. It's a bunch of other things that we've actually, for last, got permission to ask you whether your students demonstrate some of those other qualities that we know are going to matter just as much to their success. I'm hoping this will be a permanent change to the system, and ATARs may remain and fulfilling certain functions, but there's obviously, I think, a huge opportunity here. So, if there is something about focusing on inquirers, not learners, I want to say a word or two about the kind of shape of inquiry, and to talk about T-shaped inquirers. And this top of the T, the things that are the broad joining up pieces. Because the one thing we need in the world today, and that people need to navigate it and survive it, is the ability to be really good problem solvers, system thinkers, and co-creators. One of the pieces that I think helps us understand that really well is actually to think about what are the cognitive abilities that adults need much more than what kids need, because actually it's the adult cognitive skills that actually we're ultimately looking for. And Robert Keegan at Harvard wrote a brilliant book, In Over Our Heads, now quite a time ago. He's a professor of education now. He was interested in what adults needed. And the thing that adults needed is to actually be able to understand how the system around them is working. And what he called in over our heads is how we feel when we don't know what's happening to us. When the things that are around us are battering us and disrupting our lives or disrupting our worlds, and we struggle to make sense of it. And the key thing he came to kind of understand was that when people would think about how things worked as a system, instead of being trapped by it or happening to them, they could start to look at it and see what was happening and turn the system into something they thought about. And then it enabled them to have all sorts of much better outcomes in their lives. But if we're going to be system thinkers, we also need to be problem solvers. Now, we often put in curriculum, teach people to be problem solvers. My universal experience at universities is we actually don't do a good job of that. That in fact, to teach people problem solving is a distinctive skill set in and of itself. And we need to put some real discipline and focus on it. And I really got the clue in that after I'd actually got a PhD and I thought I was relatively clever. And I went to work in a firm that prided itself on problem solving. And they said, you really don't know how to problem solve, do you? 10 years of higher education, a PhD from a fancy university, and I didn't know how to problem solve. And to some degree, they were right. Actually, I didn't have a particularly well-structured toolkit for thinking through problems. That spend 55 minutes on the question, I kind of agree with that. But how do you do that? What does it look like to spend that amount of time figuring out what the right question is? That's a real puzzle. Turns out there are some great ways to do that, to figure out what the right question is. But how much time do we ever spend teaching people the techniques to think about the question rather than the answer? Very little. So I had to spend a lot of time learning how to thinking about the question, because that turns out, that quote, not to be a bad one if you want to get it right. And system thinking, we tend again not actually to often step back and really teach people to system think well, to understand how systems really work. We might do it in biology or geography or various other bits. We might kind of think we do it in history, but how often do we abstract that out and say this is a general skill that actually you can use in lots of different ways? Again, huge amount of work's been done on that. Very little of it leaks into universities or schools, despite how much actually has been thought about it. And of course, we've got to be co-creators. In the world today, there aren't problems that single people can solve, no matter how smart they are. Inevitably, problem solving is a co-creative exercise. And that's actually quite a discipline as to learn to be able to do that really well. Now, I think there's a way into that, to starting to do this. A kind of, at least some method we can use to get a little bit underway. And that is, I think everyone in all schools should learn how to become really good design thinkers. It's a kind of structured form of problem solving. It gets used in all sorts of places, but remarkably little in some of the best, in some of our schools and universities. Now, of course, in some great universities, they spend a great deal of time on it. Stanford University has a whole school devoted to it, interdisciplinary school, D school, which just teaches design thinking. Now, sometimes when I say that, people think it's what belongs in kind of technology or in some, that it's a kind of applied thing. Actually, it can be used in just in any setting at all. And it brings a particular approach to thinking about a problem. It starts with, and you might be surprised when we're starting with it, the first step is empathise. So if we're going to get a question right, the first thing we're going to do is explore the area we are trying to get this problem solved in a deeply empathetic way. And that means basically stop talking, start listening in multiple different kinds of ways. And there's a whole set of techniques you can use to become a better empathiser and explorer of the kind of issues and problems in front. So before we even get to defining the question, which is the second step, we have to really have built a much richer picture than we often do. To be able to define it, and there again, that's where you spend a whole bunch of time figuring out how you actually get the question right. And then the third step, and it's kind of, I think it's a bit jargony, but it is the jargon, ideate. So what to ideate, it means generate, don't think you just get the right answer the first time. In fact, that's sort of the enemy of curiosity and learning and good inquiry, is to think we can get the answer right the first time. Too often we take kind of maths as the paradigm. There is only one way in which these things add up to give you a correct number. In fact, we have to see that that is a dangerous paradigm, that mostly the problems that we need to solve have multiple answers. And the best of them is probably solved by an aesthetic criterion or a logical one, which is it's an elegant answer. But we've got to find it out. We've got to actually try it multiple times. And in fact, so much so that even once we think we've got the answer, we should prototype it. And so one of the things that's, if you'll find people use this these days when they're designing apps, when they're designing software. Long before you put anything to code, you should actually be doing some drawing. Does it actually work? Do a paper prototype, draw the screen, see if you press those buttons, would it work? Don't put any on code, because the first thing you do is probably, actually, that doesn't work very well. I give it to my friend, I give it to McKenna. What do you think, McKenna? Finds out I'm a boring 50-year-old adult, and she says that doesn't make any sense to me, because it's full of my prejudices. So before I put any code, let's see whether an actual user, how they might interact with it. That's prototyping. So I don't waste any time, because I've tried it out. I'll try that out a few times before I put anything to code. We do it with social problems just as much. How often do we see governments launch vast schemes that some bureaucrat sitting somewhere, and I've worked with them, so I'm guilty of this, think might work, rather than actually do some pretty radical small pilots, see what happens, see all the things we get wrong, and then change it a few times before we roll it out in a big way. And then even once you've done that, we should test to see whether we've really learned it. Well, what we've really learned by this thing, because often as we put things in the field, we discover there's all sorts of second order effects and other things we needed to think about. Now, all of that top of the T stuff, which I've talked about, the kind of problem solving and being a system thinker, and just a footnote on systems thinking too. Some computer games are great for it. I know there's a kind of debate about computer games, but some computer games are fabulous ways of getting people to do good systems thinking. I really got into systems thinking with Age of Empires. It's a bit dated now, though I noticed they've produced the original version of that has come back. I enjoyed it the other day. But where you've got computers can model systems beautifully and give you a wonderful opportunity to actually see when you interact with them how systems behave in really rich and interesting ways. So let's also be alert to the fact that often students are already where the learning is happening. We need to get a bit edgy and follow them some days and figure out what it is they've really discovered by their own curiosity. Now, all of that said, for the breadth stuff, disciplinary depth still matters in the world we have today. It actually still matters to be able to do really good differential calculus, to understand the fundamentals of chemistry really well, because a lot of the cutting edge work that we've got to do is very much dependent on it. The people who are at the front line of kind of solving this coronavirus problem, they're very fancy mathematicians, they've got deep chemistry, biology skills, right at the very, very cutting edge. That still matters, deeply matters, and we don't give up on that. My thought is really very much similar to McKenna's. You get to that because you've discovered you're really passionate and excited about that kind of thing. Because actually to go to the cutting edge requires very hard work. So you better love it. And there's no point trying to get there if you don't love it. So start at the top, find the thing you love, and then be supported to go really deep. And I think part of what we do is we don't do enough across the breadth, and actually sometimes we don't go deep enough either. We don't really push to the limits. So one of the interesting things, Australian education system, which is flatlined for more than a decade, it's one of the worst performing systems on the planet because it's not improved. Virtually every other system in the OECD has improved. Now, we're not the worst system. What we are is we're not good at improving it, and that's terrible. And the other thing that pops out is we don't achieve at the high end, we don't actually do that well either. And I think that's partly because we don't actually go for depth. But I think going for depth when you're not excited about it is virtually impossible. Otherwise, it's some sort of slave-driving enterprise if you try to do it any other way. So we need to get much more. We need to be ready for that. I'm not in making this case, not arguing against depth at all. So I also then want to talk about place-based inquiry. Now, one of my kind of real concerns is that if we are interested in human growth and development, we actually have to start with the fact that we are people who live in particular places and communities. In our globalised world, we've often a bit lost sight of that, and we've become much more universalising. In fact, it's partly why I have so many issues with the fact we have a national curricula. Because it doesn't attend very well to the context of place. And just how fundamental and important that is, both to how we know, to actually being passionate about something, and to education being relevant. All those things actually do make truly inquiry-driven growth. And I think it also matters ultimately to well-being too. Because the more deeply you feel that you are a part of something, a part of all that constitutes place, the community, the physical environment, all of that, the more grounded you are, it's a really deep source of well-being. So it matters not just for better learning, it also matters for better well-being. And the kind of disconnect, my daughter was here last year and she studied this extraordinary subject, exploring the ocean. And I noticed there was a little thing saying, as a parent, I had to consent to the fact this wasn't part of the national curriculum. I did that with some joy. And then, because I thought it was probably designed around something that matters here, which it was. And then I had to consent to a risk form that I love the fact that it sort of said, basically, we'll do our best not to let your child be eaten by a shark, but if they are, it's not our fault. It wasn't quite like that, but it was kind of, that was the vibe you got as a parent. And I thought, fantastic. So real learning is going to happen here. And I wasn't wrong. And in fact, I used exploring the ocean when I'm talking about what place-based learning looks like in all sorts of places, to say it's probably the best example of it that I know of, that I've seen in a school anywhere kind of on the planet. And it is, in my view, an extraordinary way in which the very local context drives fantastic inquiry-based learning and breaks down the classroom walls and makes everything around part of learning. And of course, it actually becomes learning everywhere. Still, my daughter, when we're on the beach, can tell me now about all sorts of things to do with the biology of the creatures that we encounter in the rock pools, the shells we pick up, the things we see when we go snorkeling. And boy, does she care about it. Boy, does she care about it. And woe betide anyone who tries to fish for a stingray at Dens Point. she will feel quite ready to bowl up to them and tell them how wrong it is that they're fishing in a stingray protection zone, and give them a pretty good lecture about stingrays. And that's happened a couple of times. I just stood back. And of course, in the summer, when they were in the water, and there was a couple of beautiful stingrays there, and they were just there by the beach. I could see I was up the hill, and there were some parents screaming at them to get out of the water because there were stingrays in the water. And they got quite hysterical with our daughters, and they said, no, actually the stingrays here, they're kind of quite wonderful. And they're a screaming parent and two kids saying, no, actually, we want to be close to these creatures, because in fact the Aboriginal people saw these as the kind of key animal of this area, and we like to look after them, and they look after us. There's incredible conflict going on between kind of people who didn't understand the creature and the place and what it was all about, and some kids, thanks to wonderful exploratory education he did. So I think we need to attend to place in deep and profound ways in order to enable a very different kind of education to be happening. And I think it starts to answer a lot of those questions about relevance, immediacy, and gives us then a chance to have people educated with the knowledge that makes them powerful advocates for their own local community and the values that matter to them. That's relevance. And it turns out, gives you a fair whack of depth as well. Indeed, just to give you a flavour on that depth, when I was walking through the kind of what my daughter had learned with my colleagues at IMAS, they said basically it's the better part of a first year university curricula that they've covered. We add some extra bits here and there, a little bit more depth in a few things, but basically that's they've covered a great chunk of it. And probably if she's coming to UTAS, probably might want to skip the first year unit. Not going to get a huge amount out of it because it's already happened here. And of course they've got consistent experience of that. The last thing I do want to touch on is the importance of the profound. And I think one of the things we know is that we have a generation of young people out there, many of whom are thriving and doing extraordinarily, and we want to, I think, always be focused on that, not focused on a kind of deficit world. But there are a group that aren't, and the group keeps growing year in, year out. Mental health, rates of mental ill health, and in the age cohort that is at least half the university population, at late teenager to mid-20s, 1 in 5 will have a serious episode of mental ill health, 1 in 5. And that number just keeps inching up year on year. Suicide is a major issue. It's the principal cause of death certainly in most of young people in most parts of the country now. And all of that really is the iceberg of a bigger picture of the opportunity to be flourishing in a much bigger way. And I think we need to be returning to a sense that we are growing people where finding a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives matters, and it is part of the educational project to do that, not to compartmentalise our pieces up, but actually to help join them up to those bigger picture pieces that feel people have a sense of belonging, a sense of connection to place, to other people, a sense that they have discovered purpose and passion about what they're doing, and that there is a pathway forward for pursuing that purpose and that passion, and that there are bigger questions that actually it's not just okay to ask, but it's kind of our job in life to allow people to ask, even when we don't necessarily know the answers to them. It has to actually be okay to have some of those existentially difficult questions and not have a good answer yet. And for that not to feel a huge threat, because there's enough other things that have connected us. And I think in places like this, with their extraordinary location and setting, physical, community and otherwise, we could allow the profound to creep in a little more often and get comfortable with making a space for it. Kids talk lots about it anyway. How much do we prize open the space to actually make it safe to say that's part of our broader learning agenda? I think if we did, we would find we had kids that were healthier and happier in lots and lots of ways. So all of that, I hope, is some thought starters. The one thing I would say is it all fits with the kind of, in a university context, it's where we ultimately need to be going at its broadest. I have been working with our university to say, how do we become a more place-based institution? And we have a very, very long way to go to answer that question, but in lots of ways, the questions I'm asking here are the same ones I'm asking my colleagues. These things, and I know every bit the forces that work against kind of reform and being the disruptor and the innovator, they're not easy, they're massive, they're set in our national policy frameworks, they're set in state policy frameworks, they're set in our practice and what we've learned in lots and lots of places. It's really hard. It's really hard. But each time you make a step forward, I think you get an enormous sense of it's what matters. And the thing that inspires me every day is actually the people that we're there for. We're not there for us. We're there for McKenna and all her colleagues, and to keep listening to them and making sure that actually they're the judge.